Hi, welcome back to the Watchung Booksellers Podcast, where we bring you conversations from our bookstore's rich community of book professionals who talk about what they do for the love of books. If you're new to our show, thanks for joining us. I'm Marnie, and I'm here with my co-producer, Kathryn. Hey, Kathryn.
Hey, Marnie. How's it going?
Great. So we're excited to share a conversation about teaching today with Lee Behlman, who teaches at Montclair State, and Nick Hernandez, who was a student of Lee's but is now a teacher in his own right at Montclair High School.
But first let's do a quick check-in on reading. What are you reading now?
I am reading Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments by Saidiya Hartman, and it is book number 96 for our New York Times 100 Best Books of the 21st Century. It's our book club. Meets once a month, the last Monday of every month at 7 p.m., and we would love to have you if you'd like to register on our website. Well, how about you? What are you reading?
Oh, cool. Is it good?
It's fantastic.
Okay. Yeah. I'm going to have to make time for another book.
Yeah.
All right.
Right.
I am reading Gabrielle by Anne Berest and Claire Berest. Yeah, and Marnie and I got a chance to meet Anne Berest last fall in celebration of this forthcoming book, but we also hosted Anne along with the Literary Festival and the library a couple of years ago when she released The Postcard. But this book she wrote with her sister, Claire Berest, and it's a fictionalized story of the life of their great-grandmother, Gabrielle Buffet, who was married to the Spanish artist Francis Picabia and was also a lover of Marcel Duchamp. And it's set in Paris at the height of the Belle Époque, and it's coming out in April, so we're really excited for that to come out.
Great. Well, let's introduce our guests. Lee Behlman is a professor of English at Montclair State University, where he taught since 2006. He's a scholar of Victorian literature, and his most recent publication is a 2023 book from Palgrave Macmillan called Victorian Verse, The Poetics of Everyday Life, which he co-edited with Olivia Loxing Moy from Lehman College, CUNY. He teaches classes on 19th century poetry and fiction, the Bible as literature, the golden age of children's literature, and most recently on detective and crime fiction. He grew up locally in Queens and has been a dedicated customer of Watchung Booksellers since the moment he moved to New Jersey.
Oh, so cool. I love having Lee in store. He's great.
Yeah, he's great.
And with him today is Nick Hernandez. Nick teaches English at Montclair High School and loves spending his time rock climbing, playing in a band, and reading. His head is usually in the clouds, but he still manages to balance a comically small teacup on his person throughout the day. His favorite class to teach is dedicated to reading Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, kindly provided by a generous MFEE grant.
Enjoy the conversation, and we'll be back after to fill you in on what's coming up in the store.
Hey, Lee.
Hey, Nick. How you doing?
I'm okay. I'm in a spot where I've graded everything for the first marking period at Montclair High School, and I feel like I can breathe a little bit. So a little bit of relief, honestly. Yeah.
I too am a grader. We both are teachers. That's what we're here to talk about: is teaching literature and our lives with books. I teach English at Montclair State, and you were a student of mine.
Yeah.
How many years ago?
We had young adult fiction, I think.
The one and only time I taught that class.
Yes, yeah. Oh, yeah.
As a substitute, just to help my friend Laura Nicosia out.
It was a big deal, yeah. And I think about Laura all the time, and I think about some of the things that we read all there. I had that, I think, spring of 2015, and then I think I had the Hebrew Bible as literature class maybe fall of 2015 or maybe fall of 2016. I forget, something like that. But both really informative, or formative, I should say, like really meaningful.
Well, Nick, you were truly one of the most wonderful and insightful students I've ever had. And so I'm really excited about your success as a teacher at Montclair High. And I should say that a few years ago, you taught my own daughter.
Yeah, Eleanor's
Montclair
great.
High. Yeah. And she loved having you for that brief time before COVID hit.
I know. Yeah, I know. It was so unfortunate. I mean, Eleanor was also like probably one of the more naturally just sort of like humble and then also just like brilliant young people. And I loved that about her, so it was great to have her.
Well, she was excited to have you. I've been talking you up for a very long time. So we're going to talk about our lives in teaching, and And I guess why don't we start by just talking about how you got interested in literature itself before we talk about teaching literature.
Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like I always loved music, and I always loved rhythm, and I always loved melody. And I've been such a verbal person that in school, English was the place where those two things started to really intersect. And I wasn't like a super go-getter in English classes in high school, but I loved it. And it was always very fun for me. So that kind of dovetailed into this weird tangent where I was like, yeah, I'll do civil engineering. And then, I was like, I like to make things, like because I also like to make, art. So I
remember that you did that year, right, in college.
Yeah, it was like 3 semesters, and it kicked my butt. I totally got weeded out so hard.
Well, you weeded yourself out, and this was in Hackensack, right? This
is in Hoboken. So I was at Stevens. I was at Stevens, and I was like, we could make the robots. Like I could do some of that. But at some point, I'm like, this is so brutal, and like it's not the thing that I love in the way that, we had to take humanities courses, and I remember feeling like these are some of the most urgent things that we're doing. What I like about literature is I like creating things. I like seeing the things that other people create, and I've just always loved words. Like I've always loved talking. I've liked listening and reading and writing. So those were, I think, really the center of mass there. What about you?
I grew up in a book-loving household. Grew up in Queens. My mom was taught learning disabled kids for 25 years in East Harlem.
My gosh.
Special ed teacher. And, my dad died when I was only 13, but I have these really lovely memories of our time going to bookstores. He used to take me to Brentano's, which doesn't exist anymore, and the Strand, and all these great bookstores in the city, and just browsing the shelves with him. I just remember enjoying that experience with him and taking books home. In some ways, books were aspirational. Like we had more than we would read sometimes, which is still the case with me.
Yeah.
And with my mom, she's always been a reading lover, and I remember her. One of my favorite experiences is reading to my kid, and I loved having her read to me as a kid. I have this early memory of her reading what may still be my favorite book, which is The Munster at the end of this book.
I remember.
Grover.
Yeah.
And which is like the first work of postmodernism I was introduced to, and Grover at the end turns out he's the monster, and I remember he's trying to nail the pages together, and my mom would mimic. The difficulty of turning the pages, because then we would overwhelm him, and he would say, "Did you know you were very strong?" And I remember acting it out and doing that with her. So there was a real love for that that came early for me. And when I was in college, I was interested, like you. I was interested in science for a good amount of time. I was a bio major for part of college, but I was also.
How long were you doing bio?
Almost all of college.
Oh my gosh!
I figured out that I was a klutz in the laboratory. I was constantly breaking,
you got that
breaking
far.
things.
Yeah. Okay.
And I much preferred working with the book than actually. I didn't have the patience for lab work. But I did. I still love teaching Darwin. I just taught him again this semester, and I do try to get my interest in biology in there sometimes in my teaching. But I had one teacher who introduced me to kind of analyzing lyric poetry, a guy named Chip Tucker, who just, kind of caught my imagination. I had a class on Romanticism, and I was just sort of obsessed with the Romantics for a number of years, and that was one pathway. I was interested in religious studies and philosophy too, but those were more subsidiary to English. And so by the time I was a senior, I knew I wanted to go to grad school in English, although I didn't do it immediately. What about you in terms of getting interested in teaching?
Yeah, I think if I could try to dovetail these two, one of the things that you brought up, sort of about religion and philosophy, I do always forget to credit the fact that so much of my upbringing was very very religious in a way where when I talk to people about what every Sunday morning was like, they're like, oh, you were in a kind of theology class every Sunday where we were reading a book. It was okay, everybody, we're reading the epistles today. Let's start on page 1. And we were following, of course, sermons that were also a bit of lecture. And I remember loving that sort of community engagement, like with a book. And I think I spent so much time being encouraged to like open books with big ideas that were supposed to tell me something about the world, and like being encouraged to try that on my own and try it with other people. I think
this is an unusual Sunday school experience.
Yeah,
this is not what most people would put to me.
I know. I don't know. I mean, your Hebrew Bible class was so instructive for me too, because I think it helped round out what was also, of course, the sermon aspect of my religious education. But this is all to say, like, I felt like I was part of a really serious book club, like for most of my childhood. And if nothing else, it was a lot of like, books are important, and there are things that you should look into in those books. And I recall feeling like, yeah, let me read on my own and see what I can learn on my own and have my own ideas. Like that was very empowering to me. And so whether or not like I still feel the same way as it did 20 years ago, like I know now at least like that feeling of like you should pick up something difficult, you should try to read something challenging, you should take things seriously. Like I was like, how do I make people feel that way? You know, like, and I was like, I love to talk about books.
I remember when you were in undergrad, that you were charged with excitement by philosophy in a way that few students I've ever had have been. I think, and in particular, you ended up doing an undergraduate thesis that dealt with Deleuze,
whom I still loved, and I'm still going back to Anti-Oedipus, and
and you know him much more deeply than I do.
Yeah,
but this is maybe a funny thing to talk about, but like, what is it about Deleuze and the rhizome that jazzed you so?
Yeah, well, I mean, so I spent the summer with Difference and Repetition, and I love this idea that, like, he talks about the difference that makes a difference. Like, I love the new. I mean, this was always, in high school, Ezra Pound is, not a great guy, but the whole make it new, look at something and see what's new. Like, that as a thesis, as a banner for poetry, I was like, oh, that's something we can all participate in, and I was very empowering, like, how do I look at, the wheelbarrow and see something new? All said and done, Deleuze for me was like, that's the philosophical underpinning of what we should be doing, like bringing something incomprehensible into the world. Like what new thing could we do? And I mean, I think I spent so much of my life feeling like things could be so different, and art is always like how can I try something new for me? So I think for Deleuze for me is where like aesthetics become really philosophical.
You should mention one book by him that's been particularly useful to you. I think they're gonna put it on the website.
Yeah,
so which is it? Anti-Oedipus?
I'm not done with Anti-Oedipus yet, but of course I love thinking about that. I don't know. It might be.
This is not your starter philosophy, by the way, folks. This is, I wouldn't begin there.
Yeah. Well, Miller gave me
waters.
that. It like just totally spun me around. Yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about teaching per se. Like
totally.
How that came to you. I'll tell you a little bit. I mean, it wasn't.
Yeah.
I don't think, even though my mom was a teacher, and I definitely think she influenced my manner in the classroom, because I used to visit her at school and I got to see her with her kids, and she was just wonderful. But I was not a natural at first. It took me a long. I mean, I started TAing when I was in grad school, and I was nervous and overbearing, and I was way too hard at the start. But it just took me a long time to get comfortable. Although I've always wanted to be an actor. I'm a terrible actor, but I got my acting bug out just in front of the classroom. I have a captive audience. But it took me some time, and I love it, and I can feed off it now. But I don't think it came fast for me. I have a feeling it came faster for you.
I don't know. I mean, I think it's a lot of faking. I mean, I was about to ask, like, do you still get nervous? I do.
In a good way. Yeah.
Okay.
Rarely in an unpleasant way. And But if I feel like I don't have it all up in my head. But then again, if I prepare too much, then it's often flat.
Right.
Yeah, so I have to find some middle ground.
I mean, are you sort of also thinking about like, this should be a space where maybe something can be improvised out of a discussion?
Yeah.
Like, are you sort of planning for that too?
I'm always I always like to move between discussion and lecture. I think, this is an old bugaboo of mine, but I mean, I think lecture is underrated. Like in college teaching these days, everything has to, we're all about student-centered learning, but I do think that the art of the lecture is still an important one as part of your toolkit. Yeah. And it's one that I respect. Some of the best classes I had in college were pure lecture courses. Although I don't teach that way. Yeah. I do one way which I try to bring in, make myself bring in content into classes is, this is like, I love the art of the handout. So I love these little info downloads I can do through just making up handouts about various subjects related to. I'm a 19th century British lit person, I'm a Victorianist, but I teach other stuff like the Bible, as you talked about, myth and literature, and I have a new course I'm teaching to talk about a little bit later on crime and detective fiction, which is a lot of fun. A gen ed course, but I always try to give them informational contexts that we can advert to during discussion to enrich, and then go back to kind of asking questions and digging into the text. I like to make those kinds of moves, macro and micro.
I find myself doing that, and so I mean, my question really is kicking a lot into place for me because like I myself today was a bit nervous. Is like I like to do the same macro and micro. I am probably sort of imitating stuff from you and some of the other faculty at Montclair. One of the pedagogy professors I had was like, one of the trends that he said they noticed was it doesn't matter how much prep you give a student teacher. Like once they're in front of a class, they just revert to imitating the teachers they liked the best and learn the most from, Yeah. So
that's why I love to watch people.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think I'm probably picking up a lot of the things that you and the other faculty are doing. But I was borrowing, so I was visiting, sort of auditing part of your Victorian poetry class a while ago over Zoom, and trying to figure out a way to think about monsters. And so I borrowed that poem that you used, The Kraken.
Oh, yeah, I usually start with that. That's a wonderful Tennyson poem about this creature that battens upon sea worms and it lives under the sea. And it's a great sonnet.
And like I felt myself get really nervous of like, who knows how this is going to go? Where?
Oh, you taught it to your students?
How did
it go? I want to know.
Some of it went really, really well.
Yeah.
It's so interesting. Like it doesn't matter what course you have. Like it's so dependent upon the sort of random chemistry of the kids in the room.
Of course.
So I think it did what it needed to do, and I think it was exciting. And there's just like some really great, somebody asked what battening. They're like, oh, what is battening? Like, what is he doing to the worms? It's like, that's a great question.
I usually, the way I would answer that question is I just start gnawing in front of them, dramatically with my mouth.
Yeah.
That's my theatrical instinct.
Yeah, that and like the arms winnowing the sea growth. Like, it's such a great
you remember
two set of lines. Well, I was just reading with them today, but like I was getting nervous with them, and I was like, my coworker Aunt Bainey is spot on when she's like, we need to find a way to not just talk around the text when you talk about the actual words in the text.
Oh yeah.
So I was like trying to use the Kraken to start as we thought around.
This is a frustration that you can have with. I have had sometimes with students, especially ones coming out of high school, where they think that what I want from them is like identify the symbol. I talk about the symbol. I'm like, I don't really want to talk about symbols. I want to talk about what it means. I want you to paraphrase it for me. What's happening? Tell me what's actually happening here. Don't focus on 3 words. The dynamic quality of the writing is what I want them to kind of capture and be able to articulate.
Yeah.
And that's why I love teaching dramatic monologue, which is the whole sort of 19th and now contemporary kind of poetry.
Yeah.
Starting with figures like Robert Browning and also Elizabeth Barrett Browning, where there's a speaker who, it's as if it's cut out of a play by Shakespeare, but you have no context. And they're robbed of context, and it's frightening to be robbed of context. But then to get our hooks into it and figure out what that context is always an adventure and always great fun with them, and they get to sort of start to become amateur psychologists and do that mixture of judgment and sympathy. That's one of the most fun kind texts that I like to teach is dramatic monologue poetry. This is a big part of 19th century poetry.
Your phrase like robbed of context is like, oh my God, that really resonates with me. And I am immediately sort of confronted with thinking about an acquaintance of mine, Lily Greenberg, a poet, was like trying to give me advice. I was like, if there were poets you think I should talk about with my kids, like who should I talk about? And she was like, the thing that I think doesn't get emphasized enough is like looking at a poet's full book of poems.
Completely.
Yeah.
And so when I have a class on women poets that I teach sometimes, and I only, in the second half of the semester, and it's all African-American women poets, mostly 20th and 21st century, I only teach full books.
Yeah. I'm so bad at that.
Yeah. No, it's really fun to do because they can sort of see, it's out of context, just one or two poems, but making them work through the whole book or doing it with them, it's an experience, and they can thinking about the whole structure of a book of poems, like Claudia Rankine's, more recently, and some others. And, I love teaching that stuff too.
Yeah, I mean, part of what I also really loved about your Hebrew Bible course was like noticing the pattern that exists across books in the Tanakh, right? Like that to me is like, you gotta, we really have to zoom out constantly, look at relationships between movements.
Well, I should say I'm a 19th century person, but that is my favorite thing to teach.
Yeah.
Is the Bible. I've taught some parts of the Christian Bible, but for the most part I teach the Old Testament or Hebrew Bible in translation as poetry and as history. And I love to, get them to see that it's of course it's an anthology that was put together over about 900 years, and just see how the different parts work differently from each other, but also how they can connect, how it's like there are different genres in it. There's love poetry.
Yeah.
There's
I think about that all the time.
All kinds of different writing in it, and it's closer to being something like the Norton Anthology than it is to being a novel. And that's always fun to do, and I also just love the material so much, and things like the David story. I find to be so dramatic and wonderful. And also we talk a lot about gender when I teach the Bible, both at the undergrad and grad levels. I'm not an expert, by the way, on the Bible, but I do love to teach. One of the things that's really interesting about teaching the Bible, mostly in Montclair, I get kids who don't have a lot of experience with it, that may have read a little bit in CCD. I get a lot of lapsed Catholics. But when my first 5 years of my career, I taught in Kansas at Kansas State University, which was actually great. And I had a significant minority of students who were pretty serious evangelical kids. They were lovely by and large, and nearly all of them. But some of them, especially the Baptists, had a kind of intimate knowledge of the Bible that I will never have. I can't tell you what Deuteronomy 9:16 is. And there were some kids who could tell you.
Oh my God! Growing up, there was we had to memorize Bible verses.
Okay, so it's a very odd experience to walk into a classroom and know that on some level some of these kids know it better than I do, but they don't have the same interpretive framework that I have, and the kind of historical backgrounds and context that I could provide. But it was just funny, I loved having the Baptist kids, by the way, because man, they really know their Bible.
Well, that was much of my upbringing was this you're in a boot camp at least once a week. I mean, I was spending 3-4 days at church a week.
Did you go to Bible camp in the summer?
Yes, absolutely.
Oh, wow.
Absolutely went to Bible camp. Went to retreats.
I had no idea.
Yeah. It was so. I mean, it's probably why I'm so intense. But yeah, I mean, things were very serious, and so I always had this sort of textual, severity about me, and it was always what are these words? Can you recall them? Do you have an interpretive? Do you have an analysis of them? Are you able to at least repeat connections?
You're learning hermeneutics as a kid.
Crazy.
It doesn't sound like it was all too literal either. It sounded like there was some flexibility.
Here and there. I think I was bootstrapped with enough to develop maybe some of what I also I remember going home and I'm in sixth grade. I'm what am I gonna do? Let's read 1 Samuel. I've never read sitting down. Which is to say, I don't. Much of it was forgotten.
One of the things I love to teach is Robert Alter's translations.
Well, those are big, yeah.
Yeah, they're very literary, and his edits. It's just a wonderful editorial apparatus, and the translations are gorgeous and well informed. And he's such a sophisticated reader of the Bible. that I love to read him and then to compare him with other translations, just to try to give students that experience.
I mean, I still have those copies, and I remember passing to people like, "Oh, this is Alter's like Genesis, and it's really good." You know,
Robert
like
Alter's
just
Genesis.
to coworkers and stuff, and family members. I also, of course, I'm always recalling like you had this one moment. We were looking at a handout, and you were like, say what you will about the King James Bible, but they knock it out of the park with this one line in Songs of Solomon, where it's like, comfort me with apples. Was that the phrase? And I was like, oh, that's beautiful. That's so moving,
That's the title of Ruth Reichel's autobiography.
Yeah,
too, which is a great title.
It's so good. It's so good.
I'm curious to know about how your training in, when you got your degree in education in English, how your pedagogy training prepared you for the classroom and didn't prepare you for the classroom. I'm really curious.
That's a very good question. I think I probably forgot most of it in panic the second year in front of kids. I think what has really worked and what I definitely, Montclair deserves a ton of credit for it, was like just a lot of really good models. Like people who knew their stuff, and when they didn't, knew how to like really honestly try to open those questions to the class, like in moments where I was like, this is something I don't know a lot about, but it makes me wonder, like, and what do you think? Like those were interesting invitations. And if nothing else, like so many of the faculty that I had at Montclair, like loved what they were talking about. And I think that was the thing. I was like, if you get up there and you love what you're doing, like the enthusiasm will be infectious. And
well, we have very lovable students.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah, they're
totally.
great kids.
They are. And I really, I think that's obviously the thing that people love about teaching is the people work of it. I mean, I'm sure this is part of the college.
You told me you have a really good amount of flexibility with developing courses and selecting
Absolutely.
text. Which is great. Tell me about that.
Yeah. So, I love teaching in the Civics and Government Institute at Montclair. I get to have this sort of small learning community where the government studies course once a week is a teacher-based elective. And so, like Montclair has been so great. I showed up and all my coworkers that I had just met said, we're going to teach like a 10-week course. What do you want to do? And it was like so exciting. And I was already thinking like, okay, like, how would Lee have done something like this? Like how would, Lorna Koja or, Greenberg or Miller or Liebler have done this? And the most exciting thing lately, and I'm going to start it again, was MFEE, the Montclair Fund for Educational Excellence, bought us a class set of Our Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis. And like we get to talk about, prison abolition. And the kids are 15 to 18, and they come from a ton of different backgrounds, and we just get to read and talk about it. And
did you request those books?
I did, yeah.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and MFEE said, like, please go on straight ahead, and it's lovely. We sit in a circle and we talk about this book, and we get to share our thoughts back and forth, and I get to do it again. And it's... I don't know where else I would do something like that.
Yeah, I'm so happy to hear it. Thank you, MFEE.
Yeah, big time. Big time thank you, MFEE. I mean, even for some of my AP Lang sections, they've bought us copies of Braiding Sweetgrass, and I've used selections from Braiding Sweetgrass. Yep. And, like, I've had students, like, lovely students go, like, this author is so sweet and kind. Like, and you can just tell, and they're like, I love the way that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about ducks. Like, how else, where else am I seeing somebody talk about animals that way, that aren't our pets? And these are things that kids are saying, and they're obviously smart and they know things and they have thoughts, and I like to be part of that, which is probably, I think, why teaching English has been the thing for me, like being in a room with like a book, which is sort of part of a pretense of getting to know these people and learning about them and thinking about things together, especially when it's hard, like challenging. I don't know, like what are things that like feel really urgent for you in your classes with your students?
Well, I mean, in the past, I've had students in my Hebrew Bible class who are queer, and who have come to me with questions about how do I read people have been citing these passages at me.
Oh wow!
I have other ones for them to look at. I have other books to show them, and I try to take them out. We talk a lot about the way in which the Bible has been weaponized over years to do things like defend slavery. It can be used in all kinds of ways over history, and I'm very sensitive to that in my teaching. I know I am concerned, of course, about how my trans students, of which I have an increasing amount year by year, and my undocumented kids who I can't really identify, but we are at HSI, an Hispanic serving institution, so I'm concerned about their welfare.
Yeah.
I know this is something that's of urgent concern to me and a lot of my colleagues at Montclair State.
Yeah.
As far as in the classroom goes, I like a charged classroom. So I welcome challenges all the time. To me, and it's rarely been the case where my students have been inappropriate or unpleasant with each other. I have to remind them that we have to try to be kind to each other. Almost never happens in my courses. Maybe it's partly because of what I teach. I don't think so though. I think some of the stuff I teach can be quite charged. So I don't know if that's what you meant by difficulty.
I guess I'm thinking I don't know. I think about Ta-Nehisi Coates is like I didn't want to feel hopeful. I wanted to feel equipped. And I always liked when school was here's a tool, here's something that you can hold on to that you can do what you will with. And I should say that relationship was always about trust, and I always felt like at Montclair State, the faculty trusted us with big and difficult texts. And I know the Hebrew Bible course was a great example of that. And I also felt some of that with your young adult fiction class too.
That was such a one-off for me. It was sort of an experiment. When I had my kids, that got me interested in children's literature more than I ever had been. And that's when I started to develop the course on Golden Age of Children's Lit. And my colleague Jim Nicosia teaches it. It's on late 19th and early 20th century.
I hope Jim's doing well.
Children's Lit. Yeah, he's great. And I'm so glad that he's teaching it too. I'm going to probably start teaching it again soon. And, and that's stuff like Alice in Wonderland and
we read the Jungle Book. That was awesome.
I teach the Jungle Book.
The Jungle Book was great.
The thing was, I was resistant to classic YA in some ways. So I was trying to fit things into that course that maybe didn't belong. When I was just because I was I didn't really necessarily want to teach all of that stuff. But it's interesting to think about YA because it has in its history. I want to talk about. I have this theory about it's not YA, but it's about why I have my job, or why there have been a lot of English jobs until relatively recently in academia. At least there was a kind of one thing that stabilized the market. I don't have any data to base this on.
Sure.
And speaking of problem, you're talking about Ezra Pound as being problematic. J.K. Rowling is kind of a problematic person.
Yeah, kind of is a generous.
But there was a time, and maybe it was a little bit before your time, maybe overlapping with yours, when I felt like a large majority of my students came into reading themselves through the Harry Potter books.
Totally.
And they became English majors as a result. It was like this feeder network from those books, and I was grateful for it for the longest time. There have been other phenomena, book phenomena, the whole YA phenomenon after that, and more recently romantasy and
oh my gosh,
but that brings students into English, into a love of reading and literature. But there's nothing that's been quite like that as a sensation, and I hope there will be. we need it.
If I could piggyback, your point about Harry Potter really works for me in a couple levels, which is to say, I remember not being allowed to read Harry Potter, right? That was sort of the religious context where I was growing up. It was no, that's witchcraft, right? All of this is to say, I think what I appreciate about reading in itself is this slow, contemplative, reflective, necessarily distended activity that it is. And I think it's probably better to moralize less about what people are reading and instead to think about them reading as its own benefit. I mean, recently one of my students held this really, really lovely event for kids in our AP Lit class to get their thesis books that they have to write their paper on. And to get together for a period in the morning and to quietly read for 50 minutes.
Lovely.
And I can't tell you how many of my students were like, that was amazing. Like, we should do that more. I like reading because I like that slowness, and I think we probably all would benefit from more of that slowness.
We certainly need it right now.
Like,
I brought in a speaker last week who would have been very interested. You will be interested in her. She's a professor at Illinois Chicago.
Okay.
Named Anna Kornblad. She has a new book out called Immediacy. It's about how everything, we live in a time when cultural products just bombard us.
Yeah.
And we're there for quick pleasures and quick downloads, and what she argues is that we don't have the kind of mediation of, particularly of genre or form. A lot of people, and that's for her. That's why autofiction is increasingly popular, and TikToks, and she's somebody who's very much coming from a left perspective and seeing the immediacy itself as being actually it's a part of sort of a structuring element of our society and
totally
and of capitalism, and she would very much embrace your idea that we need the kinds of experiences, including reading experiences, that require some distancing, some contemplation. And I think literature definitely provides that. I always talk to my students, this is boilerplate, but near the end of my semester I say, this class is going to be less than useless if your only experience with these authors and these texts is from this semester. If you don't come back later in your life and revisit some, I don't expect you to love everything we've read, but I hope that you'll come back and revisit some of the books and some of the authors that we've read and explore them further, or some of the issues that we've read, and that'll enrich your future life. And because I don't think of what I'm doing when I teach literature as a present tense activity. I think of it as beginning or being part of a lifelong process.
Yeah. I could not agree more. I feel like part of what I'm trying to do with students, or I feel like, what I loved about school was when somebody was giving me something that I could leave the room with, which is to say, I feel like I'm trying to repeat to my students, like, I will know you for a very brief time. Like, I'm trying to give you things where you won't need me. I would like to actually undermine this sort of authority in our relationship. I would like for you to have everything I know, and then, you're going to have to live your life. And I think that's really why, it's why I love learning, and I think books are a great way of thinking about that. I don't know. I want slower, which is not like poems, I guess, if I could. So like, Lee, when you first reached out to me, you were like, we'll talk about teaching and books and poetry. One of my first loves was poetry, I think, in part because it was easy to go back to. Like, it was easy to have a relationship with. It was easy to do like my first rereads and like third and fourth reads, and it felt like something that was also asking these big questions of, I'm just thinking about Mary Oliver. Like, to make a poem, we have to make sounds. And to make sounds, we have to pick words. And to pick words, we have to ask ourselves, like, is it a rock or is it a stone? And why is a rock not a stone? And, like, that, you have to sit with that.
Yeah.
And I like that. And
these are good mental habits
to
develop.
Yeah.
No, I mean, it's an end in itself too, the beauty of the work. But no, you're right. This is something that can help our students in their lives as well.
Yeah, I've always wanted to, I don't know.
What poets are you into these days?
For the past few years, I've loved Layli Long Soldier.
I have not read Layli Long Soldier.
She wrote a book in response to the Obama administration's official apology to Native peoples, and her book's called Whereas, and she just was reflecting about all of the whereas clauses in the official apology. And so she has a number of responses that some of them are, whereas there was violence on both sides. And so she's immediately trying to engage with what it means for her to be Lakota Sioux. And I have loved her poem 38 for some time, and I always come back to that poem.
Have you taught it?
Yes. Almost every week before Thanksgiving. I'm like, let's read this. And in particular because it's about like a piece of history I just had no clue of. And Layli Long Soldier, I think, like, to me is thinking about her political and social position and thinking about the art that she can make in a political and social context. The very end of the poem is reflecting on it's about the largest mass execution in U.S. history, which took place the day after Christmas in 1863, if I recall. So this is during the Civil War. Lincoln was like, all of these Lakota Sioux who were killing government officials were all hanged. And so Layli Long Soldier is using like the gallows and sort of thinking about like rhythm and time. And at the end, like the verse sort of like cracks open, not to pontificate, but like sort of cracks open like the time of the poem in a way where like the swinging of the body on the gallows is actually sort of like it breaks into a kind of like freedom from the poem itself. She's always constantly thinking about like, this is not a poem. And I don't know, I still am constantly learning from that and seeing new sort of valences to it. But this is to say, like, Layli Long Soldier, like, I feel like everything I read from her is electrifying. And anytime I show her poems to kids, they're like I remember we were doing an elective about trickster tales.
I'm teaching Monkey, right?
Yeah.
You didn't have that with me.
I don't think so.
Oh my God, it's Journey to the West, the great Chinese trickster figure.
Okay.
It's a 16th century Chinese so-called novel. It's a kind of a work of a long prose work.
Right. Okay.
And it's very, very funny. It's sort of like a live action comic book, a comic book come to prose life.
Yeah.
It's really, really influential in Chinese culture to this day. And so I got to teach that and some other African trickster figures and some others in my Myth and Lit course. I'm doing that right now.
I mean, you were talking about that a bit with Jacob, as I recall.
Yes, very much so.
Like, yeah. And that was a big sort of connection in my mind. But this is to say, yeah, I mean, like, we were reading Native American trickster tales and
like Coyote.
Yes, totally. Bit of Nanabojo.
Don't know too much about it.
Yeah, Nanabojo's hilarious.
Okay, check it out.
A lot of scatological, like, sort of humor. All said and done, we were pausing and we were reading some of Layli Long Soldier's poems, and like what I thought would be a 20-minute conversation was an entire class. And the kids left me like, well, what about this? And
that's the best.
It's
when they take it away from you.
She's fiery, yeah. What about you? Is there a poet that you've been loving lately?
Over the summer, I found myself listening to. I take walks in the Lenape Trail, and I got some audiobooks of poets, and some of the ones that I've really enjoyed is a collection called Couplets, which is a very funny and moving story, apparently very autobiographical story about a woman who's a long-term relationship with a man who has a new relationship with a woman.
Okay.
And I'm probably going to teach it next semester, actually.
Oh.
I can't remember the name of the author, but Couplets. It's a lot of fun. Okay. And one of the ones I loved listening to is Donna Smith's Homie. He performs that so beautifully, and it's so funny. And what else? Terrence Hayes. I mean, I've read Terrence Hayes is an African-American poet that I really admire. He has a book called American Sonnets for my past and future oppressor, or something along those lines. The book I wanted to talk about that I'm enjoying right now is a book about children's literature that is not by a scholar so much, but I think he's a critic in the UK named Sam Leaf, and it's brand new, and I'm just digging into it this week, but it is so much fun. It's called The Haunted Wood, and it's a history of childhood reading, and the way he kind of does his history of children's literature is to focus on children as readers and that side of it, and their experiences of literature going all the way back. And he has a big chapter at the end just on picture books, and it's funny and perceptive. It focuses, for the most part, on British stuff,
Okay.
because he was originally published in the UK. But I really recommend it if you're interested in children's lit. I adore it. I'm probably going to end up using it in my teaching. And I've been having a lot of fun teaching this class on this new gen ed class on detective and mystery fiction.
Yeah, that must be new, right? Did you?
It is.
Okay, yeah.
And
I was like, I wish I told. Yeah.
I just created it. So,
Okay.
hopefully it'll be a permanent course eventually. So I got to teach authors, some of the 19th century stuff, but also 20th century authors like Dorothy Hughes In a Lonely Place and Raymond Chandler and
Yes, okay.
Dashiell Hammett and a writer named Elizabeth Saxe Holding, who wrote this kind of mid-century domestic thriller set during World War II. It's really about the home front. World War II keeps coming up in this class in really productive ways. And actually, just yesterday, Art Simon, who's a wonderful film professor.
His class was great.
He's an expert on Hollywood film in the mid-century, came and lectured to my class for a whole class about the film adaptation of In a Lonely Place. So one of the fun things about teaching is you develop new courses and new curricula and new text to study. You force yourself to learn.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
So I sometimes throw myself into teaching something I'm not actually that familiar with.
Yes.
And I'm it's a high wire act, and that's actually really exciting.
I really loved a couple years ago, and Naomi Liebler had a really funny response to this. Pierre Bayard has this book called How to Talk About Books You Haven't Read. And one of the things he's saying is like every book you read is also a commitment to books you will not have time to read, right? So we're sort of always self-selecting, and we're always taking books off of the potential books we might get to. And sort of he as a professor of literature in France is trying to engage with like, look, I don't want to interrogate kids. I don't want to get better at interrogating like the inner workings of their afternoon that I was not there for. Like what I want to get better at is thinking about books as, part of a discourse and how we might more honestly ask questions about things we don't know or missed when we read. I mean, a significant portion of the book involves him saying, he's this hilarious notation system where he's like, this is a book I have not read, but I remember, but I've heard great things. Or this is a book that I remember reading, but I've forgotten most of it, but I remember emotionally loving it at the time. And one of the things he's trying to encourage readers to consider, especially for students, and I think about this as a teacher, is like, how can I model the gaps in my knowledge really authentically while trying to practice? So, when you said that, or when you brought up this quote, like, is the author potentially suggesting this, or is this a pattern? Right? Like that question, I feel like in a classroom is way more important than somebody being able to repeat.
Of course. That's great. I love that.
I love that book, and it makes me think about.
I'm adding it to my list along with the poetry book.
Which is to say, like learning in front of the kids is so underrated.
Oh yeah, but that happens all the time. You're reminding me of a dear friend of mine, Laura Stevens, who is a dean at another university, which will be unnamed. She's quite brilliant. And she's so brilliant that it used to drive me crazy. In grad school, we would we would be in a class together, and we had a text assigned, and she would not get the reading done, and she would have more interesting things to say about the book than I did, and I had read the book. Yeah, she was a master of talking intelligently about books she had not read.
There's one of the chapters is, when non-readings actually lead to more authentic and generative conversations, right? It's brilliant.
Yeah, well, she's gone far, so I'm not a dean.
Yeah. So I know we were talking about the importance of students reading, and there was that famous Atlantic piece recently about the elite college students who can't read. I find myself in the position of never knowing what they've read, with certainty. I mean, is this an experience? Is this something you have too as a professor, or did that piece strike you as in one way or another?
I thought it was an intelligent piece, and it certainly was alarming. I can tell you, my experience is incomplete because until recently, I was director of the honors program at Montclair State for the last 7+ years, And so I was only teaching one course a semester while taking on that administrative job. I've just come back this semester into teaching full-time with my schedule, so I haven't taught a lot of undergraduate non-honors courses for quite a while. My experience, though, has not aligned with that. I can say I do give very easy pop quizzes if the students have read the text and they have a distinguishable pulse. They'll do fine on my quizzes that I give 5 or 6 times a semester, and that tends to encourage them to keep going. And so most of them seem to be following along fine. I haven't found it to be a serious issue, and I'm a Victorianist, so it's a particularly thorny issue because I teach these Middlemarch is 900 pages or whatever.
Which you reread recently, right?
Yeah, I teach that to grad students, and the grad students generally are doing fine with keeping up. But my undergrads, too, I've been, I don't know if I should say pleasantly surprised, but I haven't been unpleasantly surprised by their ability to keep up with the reading. So I do hear it from colleagues that it's a challenge and it's a frustration, but it hasn't affected me in any kind of a deep way, at least not yet. It was a frustration to me. This is not about you, but when Eleanor was in high school, she wasn't reading a lot of full books outside of certain classes. And I think some of her best classes were non-AP classes like philosophy and literature. I forgot the name of that guy.
Gregory Woodruff. Mr. Woodruff. I love him.
He's an unusual guy.
Yeah.
The more idiosyncratic courses, like the ones she had with you and Woodruff, taught her at least as well as these AP type courses.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard. I'm very bad at power struggles, and I think teaching encourages sometimes a sort of power struggle in which we become the detectives that find out the truth of what they've read, and I'm not good at that. So recently I've loved saying, let's take 20 minutes, let's reread this.
Got it.
And
they can talk about it then, all of them.
We can all talk about it. It's slow. I think the silence is nice. I think they like that, and the kids who've read, they get a good second or third reading, and some of my English colleagues, Beryl Steinbach, who's not there anymore, said, good reading happens in the rereading.
Yeah.
And
I sometimes I think that it's good for them to read short things and get them done in a shorter amount of time as opposed. I remember, this is just based on my own experience.
I agree.
In 9th grade, we read the Odyssey, and it took us 4 months.
Whoa,
and it was
excruciating.
It was excruciating. And sometimes that happens when they read a long text, they take forever.
No, I
don't know if that's still happening.
I can't do that. I mean, we're doing Frankenstein now.
Hey, that's
3
great.
weeks. 3 weeks.
That's not long for Frankenstein.
No, it's not long. We'll do Beloved 3 weeks. And the truth is, what I loved about at Montclair State too.
Man, I wish you had taught my daughter Beloved. That would have been awesome.
Man, that's the book. I tell them we're gonna read the best thing you'll read in high school right now. They talk about poetry too, right? I love sort of her ability to think on the page. This is all to say. In Montclair State, I loved somebody handed me Paradise Lost or Robert Alter and saying, see what you get out of it in the time we spend with it, and you'll go back, That always felt like an invitation that I had from you all, and I liked that. And I kind of like the idea of trying to pass that to students in a high school too.
So fair enough. And so I will say that my sense is that my students are willing to commit to reading.
I think my kids are, I think that they are, I don't want to I don't mean to get smarmy,
And there's too much of this discourse around about how today's students are different, and I think that can be exaggerated.
Yeah, I feel like that's always probably such a big red flag. Things used to be better.
Yeah.
A while ago, I
don't want to be that guy.
No, I don't think a lot of good thinking happens down that avenue.
Yeah. At least I don't want to dwell on it, man.
No. Can I ask? Is there anything that you've been excited to read?
Good God. I have an entire bookcase, 2 of them actually, of books I haven't read. So you're just so funny talking about, about these different categories of books you haven't read. What am I really excited to read? Jane Gardam is this Australian writer. I think she's still around, and she has this book called The Children's Bach that I read a couple of months ago that I thought was from the 1970s actually, but it's been republished in the U.S. I thought it was extraordinary. It's just a really original work of fiction about these mainly women in Melbourne in the 70s, and I want to read more of that author. I'm excited to read her. My winter breaks is when I get a chance to sort of stock up on fiction. I found, I've been kind of stressed out post-election, so there's certain comfort reads that I go to.
Totally.
I can tell you who my comfort reads are
Yeah,
lately.
please.
They include Terry Pratchett.
Oh, yeah.
Some of the Discworld novels. I find them funny and relaxing. And maybe in a similar vein, much earlier, there's the P.G. Wodehouse. Not just the Jeeves novels, but some of the other ones are very, very funny. Early 20th century to mid 20th century novels about upper-class English twits. And I also have been reading some short mysteries for fun at night. I particularly like the French, the series about the character named Maigret. There's more than 70 of them.
Oh, wow.
By Georges Simenon.
Wow.
Who wrote, I think he's the best-selling French author of the 20th century. So the Maigret novels are great fun for me at night.
Okay.
They're kind of wonderfully moody and dark. And I also really like the 1960s caper novels. They're almost all heist novels by they're just wonderful works of economy and precision by Richard Stark, the Richard Stark Parker novels. That's one of his pen names. He was an incredibly well-published author, but the Richard Stark Parker novels are some of the very best noirish fiction that I've ever read.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, I mean, the last sort of like detective-y thing... Well, actually, there's a couple. I mean, this actually answers the question in a couple ways. I'm sort of excited to get to the second My Favorite Thing is Monsters graphic novel.
I know it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I loved the first one. Was so enamored by it.
Me too.
And I don't always have that much time, so I'm very, very
It's a project. It's big.
It's huge. I'm very, very... I'm like...
Is that Emile...
Ferris? Yes. And I do spend a lot of time just looking at her recreations of paintings in ballpoint pen.
Yep. Ballpoint pen on college ruled note paper.
Just stunned by that. So I'm excited to actually dig in. I'm only maybe 5 or 6 chapters. The last detective thing that I really liked aside from that, I loved The Name of the Rose.
Ooh, good one.
That was so electrifying for me. I'm taking the Teaching Holocaust and Genocide night classes at Kane.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and I am, we have to do an independent sort of, book report. I'm reading this history of the Jewish Labor Bund.
Oh, boy, yeah.
Called Yiddish Revolutionaries in Migration, and it's sort of about, them in Poland and Russia, and then in Argentina and New York, thinking, I mean, this is such a poetic slogan. Our country is where we live, where we are, and thinking about I don't speak Yiddish, but some of the Yiddish that I'm picking up from this, is beautiful. So I'm excited to finish the back half of that. Aside from that, I've been meaning to get to, is it Artaud, Antonin Artaud? Yeah, the Theater of Cruelty.
Okay, yeah.
That's another branch of Deleuze. I'm trying to, because he's always thinking about Artaud, and I only have Deleuze's Artaud. I don't have any Artaud.
So you're gonna bring Theater of Cruelty into your classroom?
Yeah, I don't know. It just seems weird. And I'm curious. I'm
what? I love how you're continuing to just keep yourself educated and finding new subjects.
Yeah. So at the end of this, what do you want to leave us with?
Just my great satisfaction in seeing you and spending time with you, my pride in seeing what a wonderful teacher and thinker you continue to be. I'm so glad that you wanted to do this with me, and I thank you for it.
Yeah, well, thank you. It means a lot to, I don't know, just to continue to talk together about books, right? And it feels like it never ended. So thank you.
Yeah, man. Thank you, too.
Thank you, Nick and Lee, for being a part of the podcast and for all you do to create new generations of writers. We can't wait to see you in the store again soon. Listeners, you can find a link to all the books they've talked about in our show notes and at watchungbooksellers.com.
The Open Book, Open Mind series at the Montclair Public Library has a couple of great events coming up. On February 18th, they welcome Jennifer Jones, who was the first African-American rockette, to talk about her memoir, Becoming Spectacular. And on February 25th, they host best-selling author Curtis Sittenfeld to talk about her book of stories, Show, Don't Tell.
On February 23rd in the store, we host New Yorker cartoonist Liana Fink for a Sunday story time to share her new picture book, Mixed Feelings. Also on February 23rd in the evening, writers will not want to miss Henry Neff's workshop on world building, how to really create a dynamic setting that enhances the story.
You can find out details for all these events in our newsletter, show notes, or at watchungbooksellers.com.
The Watchung Booksellers Podcast is produced by Kathryn Counsell and Marnie Jessup, and is recorded at Watchung Booksellers in Montclair, New Jersey. The show is edited by Kathryn Counsell, and original music is composed and performed by Violet Mujica. Art and design and social media by Evelyn Moulton. Research and show notes by Caroline Shurtleff. Thank you to the staff at Watchung Booksellers and the Kids Room for all their hard work and love of books.
And thank you for listening. If you enjoy the show, please like, follow, and share it. You can follow us on social media at Watchung Booksellers. And if you have any questions or ideas, you can reach us at wbpodcast@watchungbooksellers.com.
We'll see you next time. Until then, for the love of books, keep reading.